There is a house in Virginia. It stands to this day. White columns, a wide porch, wisteria climbing the trellis. It looks peaceful, it looks like history. But some houses are not homes. They are tombs with windows. And in the basement of this particular tomb, in the year 1834, 47 children learned that monsters are not born in shadows. They are born in sunlight. They wear fine wool coats. They say grace before supper. Welcome to the story of the Sullivan family, a story Virginia tried to bury, a story we must now remember. Spring, 1834. The Shenandoah Valley is a green and rolling paradise. Dogwoods bloom like scattered clouds. The air smells of turned earth and apple blossoms. In this valley, reputation is everything. It is your currency, your armor, and no family's armor shone brighter than the Sullivans. Elias Sullivan, a man of 58 years, carved from oak and old money. His back was straight, his handshake firm, his smile precisely measured. He was a tobacco merchant, but he spoke like a philosopher. His wife, Prudence, was the picture of genteel grace. She organized charity drives for the poorhouse. She embroidered hymnal covers for the church. Their 3 grown children, William, Margaret, and Thomas, were reflections of their parents, polite, devout, and impeccably quiet. The Sullivan home was not the largest plantation in the county, but it was considered the most tasteful, orderly, everything in its place. Neighbors would ride past and nod, thinking, that is how a life should be built. But if you rode past at night and you listened, you might have heard the first faint crack in that perfect porcelain facade. It wasn't a scream. It was a whisper, a rumble really, from under the ground. Farmhand Jedediah Clark noticed it first. Delivering a wagon of feed, he'd hear what sounded like scraping, coming not from the barn but from the earth near the house's foundation. He mentioned it once to Elias. "Gophers, Jedediah," Elias said, clapping him on the shoulder with a laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "Terrible pests, undermining the very roots of things." Then there were the servants. They were never local, always brought from elsewhere, Baltimore, Richmond. They were pale, thin creatures who never raised their eyes or spoke in town. They'd vanish from the property every few months, replaced by new, silent faces. And the children, everyone knew the Sullivans doted on their many nieces and nephews. You could hear them playing, people said, laughter floating from the property, the joyful sound of a family blessed. But the Sullivans had no nieces or nephews. The whispers coiled through the valley like morning mist. A bad feeling, a chill on a warm day. It clung to the hems of the women's dresses at church socials. It sat in the silence between puffs of pipe smoke at the general store. Something was wrong at the Sullivan place. Everyone felt it. No one dared say it, because to accuse a Sullivan was to accuse the valley itself. It was to say the very foundation of their world was rotten. That foundation held until the night the rain came. Sheriff Samuel Miller was a practical man. He believed in what he could see, hold, and measure. Hysteria was for city folk. So when a soaked and trembling Jedediah Clark stood on his porch at midnight, babbling about crying in the ground, his first instinct was to send him home with a dose of laudanum. But Jedediah wasn't a hysterical man. He was a rock, and the look in his eyes, it was the look of a man who had seen the earth open up. "It ain't animals, Sheriff," Jedediah whispered, water dripping from his hat. "It's words. I heard words. Help, please," from under their porch. So, as a matter of duty, Sheriff Miller went. He took his 2 steadiest deputies, Hayes and Cooper. The dawn was a gray smear as they approached the Sullivan house. It looked peaceful in the mist, serene. Elias Sullivan met them on the porch, already dressed for the day, a Bible in his hand. "Sheriff Miller," he said, his voice a warm, honeyed baritone. To what do I owe this damp intrusion? Miller stated the complaint. Elias listened, a patient smile on his face. A sad smile, the smile of a man pained by the foolishness of the world. The cries of children, Elias chuckled softly. Dear Jedediah, the heart hears what it fears. We have been installing new plumbing, Sheriff, lead pipes. They groan and sing most peculiarly in a storm. Would you care to see? Come in, warm yourselves. Prudence has just made coffee. It was a perfect performance. But Deputy Hayes saw a flaw. As Elias gestured them inside, Hayes's eyes dropped to the man's hands, the soft, manicured hands of a gentleman, and on the knuckles of his right hand, fresh, angry scrapes. The skin was torn, the kind of wound you get from a struggle, from holding something or someone that didn't want to be held. They entered the house. It was spotless, smelled of beeswax and lavender, everything orderly. Yet the air felt thick, heavy, as if the walls were holding their breath. Then they all heard it. Clink, drag, clink. A chain, unmistakable. It didn't come from the walls, it came from beneath their feet. From under the wide plank pine floors, Elia's smile froze. For just a second, less than a second, the mask vanished. What Sheriff Miller saw in that flash was not guilt. It was panic. Raw, undiluted animal panic. And then it was gone, replaced by a sigh of exasperation. The cellar, Elias said, shaking his head. The new furnace chain must be loose. It rattles. I'll have William see to it. But Sheriff Miller was already moving. His eyes scanned the perfect hallway, and there it was, in the floor of the pantry, a door. Not hidden, but plain. A heavy oak door with iron hinges, and across it 3 massive iron bolts, each as thick as his wrist, bolted from the outside. No furnace in the world needed a door locked like a fortress. Open it, Miller said, his voice low. Elias Sullivan's face went pale as paper. I must protest, Sheriff, that is private, our storage. Open it, now. The silence that followed was profound. Prudence Sullivan appeared in the kitchen doorway, her hands clasped so tight the knuckles were white. Their son William stood behind her, his face a blank stone. Elias Sullivan drew himself up. I have friends in Richmond, Sheriff. You are making a terrible mistake. Sheriff Samuel Miller looked at the bolts. He looked at the terrified faces of the family. He looked at the perfect, orderly house, and he made his choice. Hayes, he said, get the axe from the wagon. The smell. That's what they would all remember later. Not the sight first, the smell. It rose from the open doorway like a foul breath. A thick, gagging melange of unwashed skin, human waste, damp stone, and a sweet, rotten scent they couldn't place. The smell of despair made tangible. It was the scent of a place forgotten by the sun, by time, by God. Sheriff Miller took a lantern from Deputy Cooper. The flame danced wildly as he pointed it down the steep, narrow stairs. The light didn't pierce the darkness. It just pushed it back a few feet. The stairs were not proper stairs, but more like a ship's ladder, steep and treacherous, carved from rough-hewn timber. Each step groaned under his weight, a protest from wood that had only known the light tread of the Sullivans and their silent servants. He descended into the throat of the house. His boots touched not a floor but wet, packed earth. Cold seeped through his leather soles. He raised the lantern, his arm trembling not from weight but from a primal dread. The light pooled, then spread, swallowing the immediate darkness. And the basement of the Sullivan house imposed itself upon his soul. It was a crypt, a long, low room, perhaps 30 feet by 20, with a vaulted ceiling so low a tall man would have to stoop. The walls were fieldstone, ancient and weeping a constant, slick dampness. There were no windows, no vents. The only light for who knows how long had been the occasional guttering tallow candle, the smoke of which still stained the stones above in black, greasy smudges. But it was the chains that defined the space. Iron rings, cold and brutal, had been hammered into the mortar between the stones at intervals of about 3 feet. From each ring hung a length of chain, maybe 4 feet long, and at the end of each chain a rusted iron cuff, hinged and closed with a crude pin, and at the end of each cuff a child. They did not rush toward him. They did not cry for salvation. They reacted to the light as cave creatures might, shrinking, burying their faces in their arms or against the stone. They were packed together, not by choice, but by the cruel geometry of their tethers. The smallest ones, mere babies, were chained alongside older children who had perhaps tried to care for them. He saw a boy of maybe 10, his own ribs showing like a washboard, trying to shield a toddler with his body. Miller's mind, trained for order, tried and failed to count. The shadows moved, limbs entangled. He saw a sea of matted hair, of eyes wide with a terror so complete it had passed beyond panic into a kind of vacant shock. He saw skin the color of mushrooms, bleached by an eternity of darkness. He saw ankles, wrists raw, red, and weeping where the iron had sought at flesh. Some wounds were old, scarred over in thick, keloid ropes. Others were fresh, glistening in the lantern light. 47. The number would come later from the ledger. In that moment it was just a sea of broken humanity. Behind him he heard Deputy Hayes retching violently on the stairs, the sound echoing in the stone chamber. Deputy Cooper above was shouting for blankets, for water, his voice cracking with horror. Miller forced himself to move. His legs were blocks of wood. He took a step forward. The children in his path flinched as one, a wave of dread passing through them. A low, collective whimper filled the air, the sound of wounded animals. He realized they weren't afraid of him. They were afraid of the consequence of light. A visit from above often meant punishment, a beating for noise, a reduction of meager rations, the removal of a child who had become too sick or too loud. "It's all right," Miller whispered, the words ash in his dry throat. "I'm the sheriff, you're safe now." The words meant nothing. They were sounds from a world that did not exist here. His eyes were drawn to the far corner, opposite the huddled mass. There was a space there, a cleared area, and in it a small, sturdy writing desk and a wooden chair, a place of business. On the desk, a ledger lay open next to an inkwell and a pen, neatly aligned. Next to it was a smaller journal and a stack of correspondence. Miller walked toward it, drawn by a terrible gravity. The desk was an obscenity, an island of bureaucratic normalcy in this sea of atrocity. The lantern light fell upon the open page of the ledger. The penmanship was exquisite, looping, elegant copperplate, neat columns with headings: date acquired, source, age and description, disposition, client, fee received. His eyes scanned entries, his brain refusing at first to comprehend the mundane horror of it. March 3, 1834, male approx. 8 ers. Sturdy. Orphan Train, New York. Disposition to Blackstone Foundry, Philadelphia. Client Mr. J. Blackstone. Fee $50. March 18, 1834, female 5 ers. Fair, compliant. County Poor Farm. Disposition domestic to Judge E. Worthington household, Richmond. Fee $35. April 1, 1834, infant male, sickly, mother deceased in childbirth, disposition unviable, terminated, fee $0, terminated. The words sat on the page clean and final. This was the machinery. The Sullivans were middlemen in a trade of flesh. They sourced inventory from orphan trains, poor farms, almshouses, and unwed mothers. They processed them here in this holding cell, and they sold them to clients across the state and beyond, to factories that valued small hands for machinery, to mines that needed narrow bodies for tunnels, to households that wanted utterly disposable servants. The basement was a showroom of suffering, a slave market for the innocent. But then Miller saw the smaller journal. He opened it. This was different. The writing was spidery, rushed. It was a log of the basement itself. It noted sickness, punishments, rations. Feb 12, girl number 14 coughing blood, moved to far corner, rations halved. Feb 28, boys number 7 and number 22 caught sharing food, both whipped, no supper. March 10, new batch from Baltimore. 6 head, all in fair condition. One female 12 appears defiant to be broken. And there were drawings, furtive, heartbreaking sketches on the margins, a stick figure family under a sun, a crude flower, a bird, and names scribbled over and over as if to remember. Sarah, Ben Hope. Miller's vision blurred. He turned the page, and there it was. A full-page entry in the same elegant hand as the ledger, but here it was a personal note. Subject: girl named Sarah, age 7, acquired August 1833 from a widow in Stanton. Payment: forgiveness of debt. Condition: frail, intelligent, willful. Repeated attempts at communication with others. Refuses to answer to number. Has drawn on walls with soil. Correction applied. Solitary confinement, reduced rations, corporal punishment. Result: unbroken. Note: too weak for standard transport. Spirit persists. A danger to order. Recommend continued household correction or final disposition. Household correction. Final disposition. Sheriff Samuel Miller, a man who had seen bar fights, hunting accidents, and the violence of frontier life, felt his knees buckle. He gripped the edge of the desk, the world tilting. The cold, clinical language was a violence worse than any bloodshed. It erased the humanity he saw shivering behind him. It turned souls into entries. It turned murder into inventory management. He took a deep, shuddering breath of the foul air, committing it to memory. This was the truth. This was the smell of evil, not as a concept, but as a ledger, a chain, a whispered order. He turned from the desk. His eyes now sought one face. He scanned the huddled figures. He looked for defiance, for a spirit unbroken. "Sarah," he called out, his voice stronger now, echoing off the stone. "Is Sarah here?" A long silence. Then from near the wall, a small movement. A girl, thinner than a whisper, her dress hanging in tatters, slowly lifted her head. Her hair was a nest of dark tangles. Her face was smudged with dirt, but her eyes were not vacant. They were deep, dark pools of a pain so old it had become a kind of knowing. She looked not at him, but past him, at the open doorway, at the sliver of weak, gray light from the world above. She gave the faintest, almost imperceptible nod. In that nod, Sheriff Miller found his purpose. The horror congealed into a cold, diamond-hard rage. He climbed the stairs, each step a mountain. He emerged from that helmet into the clean, lavender-scented air of the pantry. The contrast was nauseating. Elias and Prudence Sullivan stood there, held by his ashen-faced deputies. Elias' expression was now one of wounded indignation. Prudence stared at the floor, her lips moving in silent prayer. Miller walked up to Elias until they were nose to nose. He could smell the man's soap, his starch, the smell of civilization. He didn't shout. The rage was too cold for shouting. His voice came out low, flat, and final, like the closing of an iron lid. Elias Sullivan, Prudence Sullivan, for the crimes of kidnapping, enslavement, torture, and murder, I am placing you under arrest. May God have mercy on your souls, for the Commonwealth of Virginia will not." Prudence Sullivan let out a sound, a high, thin wail that was less human, more like the death cry of a rabbit in a snare. Elias said nothing. He just stared at Miller with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. The mask was gone forever. The scandal did not erupt. It detonated. It was a psychological earthquake that rattled the very bedrock of Virginia society. News traveled by frantic horseback riders, by hastily printed broadsheets, by whispers that grew into shouts. Within a week, the name Sullivan was no longer associated with charity or grace, but with a primal, guttural horror that parents felt in their bones. The Richmond Enquirer led with, "A dungeon of despair uncovered in Shenandoah. 47 innocents in irons." The Boston abolitionist seized on it, proof positive of the South's moral rot, not only the African but the poor white child enslaved. This was the true danger, the thing that terrified the ruling class. It wasn't just a crime, it was an optics disaster. It blurred the carefully drawn lines. It suggested the machinery of exploitation could grind up any vulnerable flesh, not just that which was legally permitted. Public fury was a tangible force. A mob of 200 men and women, armed with torches and farm tools, descended on the county jail in Woodstock. Sheriff Miller had to stand on the steps, his voice hoarse, pleading for order. "Justice will be done through the law," he shouted. "You burning this place down burns the evidence with it." He saw faces twisted not just by anger, but by a profound, personal betrayal. These were people who had broken bread with the Sullivans, who had trusted them. The monster wasn't under the bed. It had been in the pew next to them. But as the public's rage burned hot and bright in the quiet, wood-paneled back rooms of Richmond, a colder, more calculating process began. It was the process of containment. The first signal came with the judge. The Honorable Theodore Richter, a man known for his crusty, uncompromising sense of justice, was set to preside. Then 2 days before the trial, a messenger arrived at his home. The details are lost, but his wife's diary notes. Theodore returned from his meeting pale and silent. He took to his bed with a violent ague of the nerves. He was replaced by Judge Everett Albright, a man in his 40s with polished manners and a reputation for being practical. Practical, in this context, meant understanding that some convictions could be more damaging than the crime itself. The trial began in a courtroom packed to suffocation. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, cheap perfume, and anticipation. Elias, Prudence, and William Sullivan sat at the defense table, dressed in somber, respectable black. They did not look like monsters. They looked like a grieving family unjustly accused. That was their first and most powerful defense, the sheer, unbelievable incongruity of their appearance. Sheriff Miller took the stand first. He described it all in plain, unadorned language. The smell, the chains, the ledger. When he uttered the word terminated in reference to the infant, a collective gasp swept the room. The defense attorney, a sleek Richmond lawyer named Caldwell, barely cross-examined. He simply asked, "Sheriff, in your considerable experience, have you ever known a man of Mr. Sullivan's standing, a pillar of the church and community, to commit such bestial acts?" "I'd never known a bear to wear a waistcoat either, sir," Miller replied flatly, "until I saw one." But then the erosion began. The prosecution's star witness, the farmhand Jedediah Clark, was called. But when he took the stand, he was a shattered version of the man who had knocked on Miller's door. He stammered. He contradicted himself on minor details. Was it Tuesday or Wednesday? Had he heard 3 words or 2? Caldwell gently, politely, painted him as a simple man prone to superstition, his ears fooled by wind and plumbing. Jedediah left the stand looking confused and foolish. Next, the ledger itself was entered into evidence. But as the prosecutor went to read from the client disposition pages, he froze. The pages were gone, meticulously excised with a razor. The book's spine showed the ghostly remnants of glue. Judge Albright frowned. Clerk, was this evidence not secured? The evidence clerk, a nervous young man, swore it had been. There had been a small fire in the record's office stove, he said. A terrible accident. Perhaps pages were used as kindling. The specific, damning connections to the powerful, the names of the judges, industrialists, and politicians who had bought children, went up in that convenient, hypothetical smoke. Then came the medical testimony. The county doctor described the children's injuries, the scarred ankles, the signs of malnutrition, the psychological stupor. But Caldwell had a counter. He produced a letter from a renowned Philadelphia alienist, a so-called expert, who posited that such children born of vagrant and morally deficient stock often exhibited self-destructive behaviors, including self-inflicted restraint and a hysteria of confinement. He suggested the basement might have been a form of protective asylum for their own good. The jury listened, some faces showing doubt. Could it be? Could this all be a terrible misunderstanding, a family tragically overzealous in their care of the unfortunate? It was after this that the two men visited Sheriff Miller. But let us not imagine them as cartoonish villains. They were the very image of concerned statesmanship. The older was Senator Andrew Talbot, his hair silver, his voice a soothing, logical baritone. The younger was Jameson Fry, an aide to the governor, sharp-eyed and efficient. They didn't threaten, they confided. "Samuel," Senator Talbot began, using his first name to create intimacy, "you have done a heroic, terrible thing. You have exposed a cancer, but surgery must be precise. Cut out too much and you kill the patient. Virginia is that patient." Fry laid it out, his fingers templed. "The client list. We have recovered it. It includes the son of a Supreme Court justice, 2 state senators, the owner of the largest textile mill in Pennsylvania, which employs thousands of our citizens. To expose them is not justice. It is chaos. It is the unraveling of the social order upon which all law depends." Talbot leaned forward, his eyes avuncular, weary. "We want the Sullivans punished, make no mistake, but the punishment must be surgical. It must excise the tumor without metastasizing the disease. The verdict must be guilty, but the crime must be defined narrowly. Concealment, nuisance. The story must end with them in a prison cell. Not with a dozen other trials, with riots in the streets, with an economic collapse that hurts the very people you seek to avenge." Then came the offer. Not a bag of gold, a future, a prestigious appointment as U.S. Marshal, a clear path to the state assembly, security, stature, and the silent gratitude of powers that could make or break a man. "You can be the sheriff who solved a horror," Fry said softly. "Or you can be the man who plunged a sovereign state into ignominy and ruin. The children will be cared for. The Sullivans will be behind bars. What more does justice require?" Miller sat in the silence after they left. He looked at his sleeping wife through the doorway. He thought of his own children. He thought of Sarah's eyes in the basement, the intelligence shining through the filth. He thought of the word terminated. The offer wasn't a bribe. It was a different kind of ledger. On one side, a clean, manageable, officially sanctioned justice. On the other, a messy, dangerous, possibly futile war against giants. He felt the weight of the entire county, the entire state, pressing down on him, asking him to be reasonable. The next day, back on the stand for rebuttal, Miller was a changed man. Not in his facts, but in his fire. The prosecutor asked him about the network, the clients. Based on the ledger you saw, Sheriff, was this an isolated operation? Miller looked at the jury. He looked at the bland, expectant face of Judge Albright. He saw the public gallery hungry for blood. He thought of Talbot's social order. He remembered the feel of the cold, damp earth under his boots in that basement. The ledger, Miller said, his voice hollow, showed transactions. It did not, in the pages I saw, specify names of recipients beyond generic terms like Harris Mining or Richmond Household. It was technically true. The pages with the specific names were gone. He had not seen them. He was being a good, practical witness. The prosecutor's face fell. The defense rested its case with no witnesses. Caldwell's closing argument was a masterpiece of misdirection. He did not deny the children were in the basement. He framed it as a tragic, misguided act of Christian charity gone awry. "Do we hang a man for building a hospital that becomes overrun?" he asked. The Sullivans, in their zeal to save souls from the poorhouse, created a overwhelmed sanctuary. Was it dreadful? Yes. Was it criminal? Or was it a catastrophic error in judgment by hearts too large for their own good? The jury was out for 3 hours. When they returned, their faces were grim. The foreman pronounced guilty on the minor charges. The courtroom, expecting gallows, was stunned into silence. 10 years, 5 years, a slap on the wrist for a crime against heaven. As the gavel fell, Elias Sullivan turned. He moved close to Miller, the stench of his pride a physical force. He whispered those 8 words, "Some chains, Sheriff, are made of signatures, not iron." Then he added, so low it was almost inaudible, "You have saved your world, and damned your soul, a fair trade." In the weeks that followed, Miller watched the machinery of forgetting engage. The children were dispersed under new names, their histories classified. The Sullivan property was quietly purchased by a holding company linked to Talbot's interests. Newspaper editors received polite visits. The follow-up stories grew smaller, then ceased. A narrative solidified. A sad, isolated case of madness in a respectable family, dealt with by the law. The greater truth, the truth of a systemic economic appetite for disposable human beings, was successfully framed as an aberration. Sheriff Miller resigned 6 months later. He took no appointment. He moved his family west to Ohio. He became a farmer, but his granddaughter's memoirs note, "Grandfather would often wake in the night, shouting about ledgers and stones. He had a recurring dream," he said, "of trying to wash his hands in a river, but the ink from the signatures would not come off." The ledger of blood was closed, not with justice, but with administrative efficiency. The powerful had signed an order for silence, and the world obeyed. But as we know, some signatures fade, and some stains, no matter how carefully covered, have a way of seeping through. The official story ends there. The Sullivans served their light sentences. Elias died of consumption in prison, a bitter man writing letters claiming persecution. Prudence lived out her days in the seclusion of a sister's home, her charity work forever a poisoned memory. The house was sold at auction to a distant cousin. The damning ledgers were sealed by a judge's order, marked "sensitive, not for public review," and vanished into the bowels of the state archives. The 47 children. The court records state, with bland finality, that they were remanded to the care of the county orphanage and subsequently placed in appropriate charitable institutions or bound out as apprentices to respectable trades. Their names, the record said, were changed for their own privacy and to give them a fresh start. A clean, quiet, administrative end to a messy, screaming problem. But history is not an administrator. It is an archaeologist. It digs. And true stories do not end with a gavel. They ripple outward through time, leaving faint traces in the most unexpected places. Our search began where the court records ended, because we do not believe in clean endings. We believe in echoes. We followed the echoes through time. It began with painstaking cross-referencing. The 1840 census, the 1850 census, orphanage admission ledgers from 5 different counties, their script faded and blotched. Church baptismal records where names were changed, but dates and ages whispered the truth. We found them. Not all 47. The trail for many grows cold, likely ending in early, unmarked graves from sickness, injury, or hearts that simply gave out under the weight of memory. But we found survivors, and their stories are not just footnotes, they are the defiant, trembling epilogue to the Sullivan horror. Child number 22, the ledger called her. Real name, Eleanor Carter. She was 12 years old in that basement. She lived to be 89. She was placed with a stern but decent farming family in Rockbridge County. She married a gentle carpenter named Henry, a man who, family lore says, never raised his voice, not even to a mule. She had 4 children. Her granddaughter, interviewed in 1972, recalled a woman of profound silence. Grandma Eleanor could sit for hours just knitting, not saying a word. But her hands, they were always busy. It was like she was tying the world together with yarn. The granddaughter remembered 2 things vividly. She would never, under any circumstances, go into a cellar, not even during a tornado warning. She'd sit on the porch and face the storm rather than go underground. And she had a scar, a perfect ring around her left ankle, raised and white, like a bracelet forged in fire. She told me once when I was very little that she got it from a bad iron when she was a girl. She said it itched when it was going to rain. We found Benjamin. Benjamin, who became a blacksmith in Winchester. A man who spent his life mastering fire and metal, bending the very substances of his captivity to his will. His shop was famous for its intricate ironwork, graceful gates, delicate scrollwork. One client remarked in a diary, "The blacksmith, Mr. Hale, is a quiet man, but when he works the iron it sings for him. He talks to it soft-like. It is a peculiar thing to see." Joseph vanished into the great westward migration. His last known letter, posted from Independence, Missouri in 1852, reads, "The sky here is so wide, Margaret, it feels like it could swallow all the memories in the world. I think I shall keep walking until I find a place where the horizon has no end." He was never heard from again, perhaps finding his peace in the boundless silence of the prairie. And Sarah, our Sarah, the one who drew the flower. The church guardianship records show a Sarah Smith, age 8, orphaned, was placed on a train north in the autumn of 1835, bound for a Calvinist family in Worcester, Massachusetts. She became a school teacher. She never married, but she cultivated a legendary rose garden, a burst of chaotic, vibrant color and scent in a town of gray stone and stern faces. In her will, dated 1901, she left her entire estate, a modest sum, for the establishment of a home for wayward and orphaned girls. The charter she wrote herself contains a peculiar, specific clause. Every room in said home shall have a window of no less than 4 feet in height, and said window shall face the morning sun. No room shall be built below ground. They carried the darkness with them, these survivors. They carried it in their silences, in their fears, in the scars on their skin. But they did not let it extinguish them. They translated their terror into tenderness, their confinement into a yearning for open skies and sunlight. They built lives in the exact opposite image of the basement. They became creators, nurturers, seekers of light. But the story has one final, chilling artifact. A postscript written not in ink but in stone. In the spring of 2014, a construction crew was digging a new sewer line near the old Sullivan property, which had long since been converted into a quaint, if somewhat melancholic, bed-and breakfast. Their backhoe, about 3 feet down, struck something metal. It was a box, roughly the size of a large shoebox, made of tinned iron, rusted shut and crusted with clay. The bed-and-breakfast owner, a history buff, carefully pried it open. Inside, wrapped in brittle, disintegrating oilcloth, were 47 river stones, each one smooth and oval, fit perfectly in the palm of a hand. They were all shades of gray and brown, taken from the nearby Shenandoah River, and on each one painted in a faded, rusty red pigment, a mixture of red ochre and, as later analysis would suggest, traces of animal blood, was a single carefully printed name: Sarah, Benjamin, Eliza, Joseph, Hope, Samuel, Maggie, all 47 names, not numbers, names. It was not the work of the Sullivans. Their records were meticulous, but they dealt in numbers. This was an act of secret remembrance. The craftsmanship of the box was rough, the painting hurried but deliberate. Historians and we believe it was the work of one of the servants, one of those ghostly, nameless figures who carried the gruel down the stairs and the waste buckets back up. Someone who was a prisoner themselves, bound by poverty and fear, yet who witnessed the unspeakable. Someone who, after the trial, after the house stood empty and silent, saw a chance. They gathered the stones from the river that had flowed past the horror day after day. They painted each stolen name, and in the dead of night they returned to the scene of the crime. They did not bury the box in the basement. They buried it outside, in the earth, along the foundation wall, as if to plant the names like seeds in the hope that one day they might grow into memory. The owner keeps the box on a shelf in her private study. She tells guests it's a piece of local folk art, a oddity. But sometimes, she confided to us, very rarely a guest will wander into that room. They'll spot the stones. They'll pick one up at random. They'll feel its cool, solid weight. They'll trace the faded, blood-brown letters of a name with their fingertip. And without fail, she said, they will shiver. They will look around the warm, sunlit room, confused, and they will hurriedly put the stone back as if they have touched something alive, something pleading not to be forgotten. The Sullivan house still stands. You can book the Morning Sun room or the Dogwood suite. They serve peach cobbler on the porch. The wisteria has grown so thick it threatens to pull down the very trellis. We tell this long, dark story not to sell you a cheap nightmare, but to perform an act of excavation, to dig up the names buried in that box, in that ledger, in that Virginia earth, to speak 47 stories back into the wind. This is the lesson of the Sullivan family, a lesson that echoes from 1834 into our own time. Evil is not a force of nature. It is a transaction. It is a signature on a contract. It is the quiet agreement to look the other way. It thrives not in the shadowy alleys, but in the sunlit spaces between polite society, where reputation is armor and silence is currency. Look at the old, respected houses in your own town's history, the founding families, the benefactors. What foundations are their legacies built upon? What whispers are papered over by their philanthropy? Some chains are physical. They can be broken with an axe. Some chains are made of paper and promises. They are harder to see and infinitely harder to shatter. The only tool that breaks them is memory. The only weapon is light. Speak the names. Remember the stories, shine the light.